Dinner was quiet, save for the faint clinking of cutlery against plates. I had cooked that night, steak and roasted vegetables, one of Amelia's favorites. She didn't comment on it, though. She hadn't commented on much lately. Her phone rested beside her plate, lighting up every few minutes with notifications she didn't bother to hide. I watched her across the table, trying to read her expression. She seemed distant, her eyes unfocused, her movements robotic. It wasn't unusual these days, but tonight, something about her felt different. There was an edge to her detachment, like she was waiting for the right moment to speak. And then, without warning, she did. I don't regret spending the night with Richard. Her voice was calm, deliberate. She didn't look at me when she said it, her eyes fixed instead on the glass of wine she was swirling in her hand. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. But then the weight of her words hit me, cold and sharp, like a blade pressed to my skin. I set my fork down slowly, the sound of it against the plate louder than it should have been. I studied her, my face carefully blank, even as the room seemed to tilt slightly. "What did you just say?" My tone was quiet, almost conversational. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing any cracks in my composure. She finally met my eyes, a smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You heard me." It was a challenge, one she thought she'd already won. That smirk, so small, yet so loud, made my stomach churn. I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch between us. She watched me, clearly expecting a reaction, but I gave her none. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, cradling the glass in my hand, as if her words had been nothing more than a passing remark about the weather. "How very bold of you," I said, my voice steady. "Was it worth it?" She didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened. "Yes," she said, her tone dripping with defiance. "Richard knows how to make me feel alive. Something you haven't done in years." Ah, there it was. The jab, the justification. I had anticipated it, but hearing it still felt like being punched in the chest. I nodded slowly, taking another sip of wine as I absorbed her words. "Good to know," I said finally, setting the glass down with deliberate care. "I'm glad he could provide you with that experience." She blinked, clearly taken aback by my calmness. "That's all you have to say?" "For now," I said, meeting her gaze. "But don't worry. By morning, I'm sure you'll have plenty to regret." Her smirk faltered then, just for a second, but she quickly recovered. "You're always so measured, Liam. So composed. It's exhausting. Maybe that's why Richard feels so refreshing. He's not afraid to show some passion." "Passion," I repeated, the word heavy with disdain. "Is that what you're calling it? Passion? Or was it just poor judgment wrapped in cheap thrills?" Her jaw tightened, the first crack in her armor. Good. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. I finished my steak methodically, refusing to let her see even a flicker of the storm brewing inside me. She pushed her food around on her plate, her confidence waning with every passing minute. By the time we cleared the table, she seemed restless, her smirk long gone. "I'm going to bed," she said abruptly, grabbing her phone and heading upstairs without another word. I stayed in the kitchen, pouring myself another glass of wine and leaning against the counter as I replayed the conversation in my mind. Her words echoed in my head, but it wasn't anger I felt. It was clarity. She thought she had the upper hand, that her admission had given her some kind of power. But she didn't realize who she was dealing with. I wasn't the passive, complacent husband she'd convinced herself I was. Not anymore. As I drained the last of my wine, a plan began to form in the back of my mind. Amelia might not regret her actions now, but by the time I was done, she would. Regret would cling to her like a shadow, following her every step. And Richard? Well, he'd learned that crossing me was the worst mistake he'd ever make. With a steady hand, I rinsed my glass and placed it in the sink. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning. But for tonight, I let the silence of the house settle around me, a calm before the storm I was about to unleash. The morning after Amelia's confession dawned with an unnatural quiet. She had already left for work by the time I got out of bed, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and an untouched cup of coffee on the counter. I stood there for a moment, staring at the mug, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind. Her words, so casual, so cutting, were like a loop I couldn't turn off. I don't regret spending the night with Richard. The memory sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through me, but I tamped it down. Anger wouldn't get me anywhere. I had learned long ago that patience was the most potent weapon in moments like these. Amelia had laid her cards on the table, bold and reckless. Now it was my turn to play mine, quietly, deliberately, and with precision. I started with the obvious. Amelia had been slipping away from me for months, but I hadn't allowed myself to see it clearly until now. The late nights at the office, the last-minute business trips, the way she had started dressing a little sharper, paying a little more attention to her makeup, her perfume. At first, I chalked it up to her career. She had always been ambitious, striving for the next big promotion. But now I could see the signs for what they really were. The classic markers of an affair. Richard. The name was a bitter taste in my mouth. I'd never met the man, but I knew of him. Amelia had mentioned him a few times in passing, always with a glint of admiration in her eyes that, at the time, I had mistaken for professional respect. "He's brilliant," she'd said once, a faint smile playing on her lips. "He has this way of commanding a room, you know?" No, I didn't know. And now, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rest of the day passed in a haze of half-formed thoughts and calculated restraint. I went about my routine as though nothing had changed, but inside, my mind was working overtime. Amelia thought she had caught me off guard with her admission, but she didn't realize I'd been paying attention, watching, observing, connecting the dots. That evening, I decided to test the waters. When Amelia came home, she was distracted, her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. She set it face down on the counter, but not before I caught a glimpse of the name flashing on the screen. Richard. "How was work?" I asked, keeping my tone light as I set the table for dinner. "Fine," she replied, a little too quickly. "Busy, as usual." "Anything interesting happen?" I pressed, sliding a plate of pasta onto the table. She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward her phone for the briefest moment. "Nothing worth mentioning." I nodded, sitting across from her. "Must be exhausting, working so closely with someone like Richard. He seems intense." Her fork paused midair, her eyes snapping to mine. "What do you mean?" "Just an observation," I said with a shrug, taking a sip of water. "You've mentioned him a few times. Seems like he's a big deal at the company." She relaxed slightly, though the tension in her shoulders didn't completely disappear. "He is. He's the kind of leader who expects excellence, which can be a lot of pressure." I smiled faintly, leaning back in my chair. "Sounds like he keeps you on your toes." Her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. A flicker of something. Guilt? Anxiety? Whatever it was, it told me I was on the right track. After dinner, she retreated to the living room, her phone glued to her hand. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to clean up while keeping an eye on her from the corner of my eye. The way she smiled at the screen, the way her thumbs moved quickly across the keyboard. It didn't take a genius to figure out who she was texting. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, exactly, but a deep, simmering anger. Not just at her, but at myself. How had I let it get this far? How had I missed the signs until now? But self-pity wasn't going to solve anything. If Amelia wanted to play this game, I'd meet her on the board. I'd find out everything there was to know about her and Richard. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment they thought they could keep hidden. And when the time was right, I'd make sure she regretted every choice she'd made. For now, though, I kept my calm. I stayed patient. She thought she was in control, but the truth was, I had already begun to unravel the web she and Richard had spun. And soon enough, she'd realize just how much I had been paying attention. I began my quiet investigation into Richard with the kind of focus I used to reserve for high-stakes projects at work. This wasn't just about satisfying my curiosity or even about Amelia's betrayal anymore. No, this was about him. This man who had strolled into our lives, turned my wife into a stranger, and presumed he could walk away unscathed. The first thing I discovered about Richard was how easily people sang his praises, at least on the surface. He was the kind of man who left a lasting impression. Slick, charming, with a razor-sharp wit that seemed to disarm anyone in his presence. In the corporate world, that charm had propelled him to the top. He wasn't just Amelia's boss. He was the face of her company's success, the man who knew how to turn every meeting into an event and every deal into a victory lap. But I wasn't interested in the Richard everyone else saw. I was looking for cracks in his armor, and it didn't take long to find them. The first clue came during an unassuming conversation with Clara, my sister and closest confidant. Clara worked in a different industry but had an uncanny ability to pick up on corporate gossip. When I mentioned Richard's name casually, her expression immediately shifted. "Richard Bowman?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "The big-shot CEO?" "That's the one," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I've heard things about him. Rumors, mostly, but let's just say he's not as polished as he looks." "Go on," I urged, my interest piqued. Clara hesitated for a moment before continuing. "A friend of mine used to work at one of his previous companies. She said he has a reputation for using people, mostly women. He's the kind of guy who makes promises he doesn't keep, dangles opportunities just out of reach, and then cuts ties when things get messy." It wasn't exactly a revelation, but it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Richard wasn't just some harmless flirtation for Amelia. He was a man who thrived on manipulation. My next step was reaching out to Ethan, a friend of mine who worked in corporate compliance. Ethan was discreet, the kind of guy who could find information without leaving a trail. When I asked him to dig into Richard's professional history, he didn't ask questions. A few days later, he called me back. "You were right to be suspicious," Ethan said, his tone serious. "Richard has a history of questionable practices. He's been involved in 3 different companies over the past decade, and each time, there's been some kind of fallout. Lawsuits, accusations of harassment, even an SEC investigation into insider trading at one point." "Anything recent?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "There's a lot of smoke, but no fire, at least nothing concrete. He's good at covering his tracks. But if I were you, I'd keep digging. Men like him always leave something behind." It was exactly what I needed to hear. Richard wasn't untouchable. He just thought he was. The more I uncovered, the more I began to see the bigger picture. Richard's interest in Amelia wasn't purely personal. It was strategic. She wasn't just another conquest for him. She was a valuable asset, someone he could use to further his own ambitions. Through some casual conversations with Amelia, carefully orchestrated to seem innocent, I learned that she was leading a high-stakes project for the company, one that could make or break their next quarter. Richard's been so supportive, Amelia mentioned one evening, her tone almost defensive. "He really believes in me." I bit back the urge to scoff. Of course he believed in her. She was the key to his success, the golden ticket he couldn't afford to lose. But Amelia didn't see it. Or maybe she didn't want to. She was caught up in his world, dazzled by his charm, and too blind to see the strings he was pulling. It infuriated me, not just because of what it meant for our marriage, but because of what it meant for her. She was smarter than this. Or at least, I thought she was. I knew then that confronting Richard head-on wouldn't be enough. I needed to expose him for what he really was, not just to Amelia, but to everyone who had ever fallen for his lies. And to do that, I needed more than rumors and whispers. I needed proof. Richard might have thought he could manipulate his way through life without consequence, but he was about to learn that he had met his match. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to dismantle everything he had built, piece by piece. And when it was over, he would regret ever stepping into my world. The cracks in Amelia's perfect facade began to show not long after I started my quiet investigation into Richard. She had always carried herself with an air of confidence, especially when it came to her career. But lately, her posture seemed less certain, her smile a little too forced. It was as though the weight of her choices she thought she could control, was finally beginning to catch up to her. I watched from the sidelines, careful not to tip my hand. Confronting her directly wouldn't achieve anything. She was too defensive, too wrapped up in the fantasy of Richard's charm to see the truth. But I could tell something had shifted. Her once frequent name-dropping of Richard during dinner conversations had all but disappeared. When I casually asked how work was going, she'd respond with a clipped, "Fine," and quickly change the subject. What she didn't know was that I already knew why. Richard was beginning to show his true colors, just as I'd predicted. Men like him couldn't keep the mask on forever. They thrived on control, and once they felt their grip slipping, the cracks in their facade became impossible to hide. Through my discreet network of allies, Ethan, Clara, and even Lila, I'd started piecing together the threads of Richard's unraveling. Amelia was still leading the high-profile project that had first drawn Richard's attention, but the pressure was mounting. Deadlines were being missed, client expectations were spiraling out of control, and Richard, ever the opportunist, was shifting the blame onto her. What had once been his unwavering support had turned into thinly veiled criticism, delivered in front of her colleagues with a precision that left her humiliated and scrambling to defend herself. One evening, she came home looking more exhausted than I'd seen her in years. Her usual sharpness was dulled, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the couch without a word. I waited a moment, studying her, before breaking the silence. "Tough day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She exhaled heavily, staring into her glass. "You could say that. Richard giving you a hard time?" I pressed, careful to keep the question casual. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would you say that?" I shrugged. "Just a hunch. You've been working closely with him, right? Sometimes those relationships can get complicated." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. "It's nothing I can't handle." I let the subject drop, but her reaction told me everything I needed to know. The pedestal she placed Richard on was crumbling beneath her, and she didn't know how to reconcile the man she'd idealized with the reality of who he was. What she didn't realize was that Richard's treatment of her wasn't just about the project. Through Lila, who had quietly been gathering intel while keeping up the pretense of a friendly relationship with him, I learned that Richard had already started cultivating a replacement. A younger, more malleable employee who lacked Amelia's experience but was eager to please. It was his pattern, his modus operandi. Amelia had served her purpose, and now he was preparing to discard her. It would have been easy to gloat, to confront Amelia with everything I knew and force her to see the truth. But I resisted the urge. She wasn't ready to face it yet, and I needed her to come to that realization on her own. If I pushed too hard, she'd retreat further into denial, clinging to the fantasy of Richard even as it fell apart around her. Instead, I bided my time, watching as the cracks widened. I noticed the way her confidence faltered during conversations, the way she hesitated before answering questions about work. I saw her flinch when her phone buzzed with yet another late-night email from Richard, the once thrilling urgency of his attention now a source of dread. One night, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her laptop, I leaned against the doorway and crossed my arms. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," I said lightly. She didn't look up. "It's just work," she muttered. "It'll pass." "Will it?" I asked, my voice soft but pointed. "Or is this something bigger?" Her fingers paused on the keyboard, but she didn't respond. For a brief moment, I thought she might open up, might finally admit that things weren't as perfect as she'd made them out to be. But then she shook her head and went back to typing, shutting me out once again. I walked away, letting her stew in the silence. The truth was closing in on her, and I didn't need to force it. Richard's mask was slipping, and soon enough, Amelia would see him for who he really was. When that moment came, I'd be ready, not just to expose the full extent of his manipulations, but to remind her of the price of betrayal. For now, I waited. The unraveling had only just begun. Patience has always been my greatest strength. Amelia thought she could keep her secrets tucked away, safe behind her carefully curated lies and late nights. But I had been playing this game longer than she realized, and with every passing day, the web around her, and Richard, grew tighter. It started with small, deliberate moves. Lila, who had taken on the role of my quiet ally, continued her feigned friendship with Richard, meeting him for coffee and casual conversations. The man thought he was untouchable, and his arrogance made him careless. He would lean back in his chair, talking about his vision for the company, casually dropping hints about the people he used and discarded along the way. Lila recorded every word, and piece by piece, his true nature began to emerge. He's already scouting someone to replace Amelia, Lila told me one evening over the phone. There's a new hire. Young, eager, completely naive. He's grooming her to take over Amelia's role. I clenched my jaw, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. It was exactly as I'd expected. Richard had built his entire career on manipulation, and now he was preparing to throw Amelia under the bus. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had betrayed me for him, and now she was the one being betrayed. Meanwhile, Ethan had been digging into Richard's professional dealings. He uncovered questionable contracts, conflicts of interest, and a trail of disgruntled employees who had quietly been paid off to keep their mouths shut. It was a damning collection of evidence, and we were only just scratching the surface. Richard's good at covering his tracks, Ethan said during one of our late-night strategy calls. But he's not perfect. There's enough here to raise questions, especially if it comes to light at the right time. I nodded, already envisioning how I could use the information. Richard's empire was built on sand, and it wouldn't take much to bring it crashing down. But the most significant piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Clara called me with an edge of urgency in her voice. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "I just got off the phone with an old colleague of mine, someone who used to work with Richard. He's been pulling the same stunts for years. And get this, one of his previous victims is willing to talk." Her name was Hannah. She had been in a position similar to Amelia's, a rising star in her company, seduced by Richard's charm and promises of mentorship. But once she outlived her usefulness, he had cut her loose, tarnishing her reputation in the process. She had spent years rebuilding her career, and though she had moved on, the scars of Richard's betrayal remained. "I'll talk to her," I told Clara. "If she's willing to share her story, it could be the final piece we need." Meeting Hannah was a sobering experience. She was calm, composed, but there was a sadness in her eyes that spoke volumes. As she recounted her experience with Richard, I felt my anger solidify into resolve. This wasn't just about Amelia or my marriage anymore. This was about exposing a man who had built his success on the broken lives of others. "He thinks he's untouchable," Hannah said, her voice steady. "But men like him always slip up. He'll make a mistake. And when he does, you have to be ready." Her words stayed with me as I continued to gather evidence, each piece bringing me closer to the moment I had been waiting for. I knew I couldn't rush this. Richard was slippery, and if I moved too soon, he'd find a way to twist the narrative in his favor. But with Ethan, Clara, Lila, and now Hannah on my side, I was building a case that even he couldn't escape. At home, Amelia was unraveling. She came home later and later, the tension in her shoulders visible even from across the room. She didn't talk about Richard anymore, but I could see the cracks forming. He was pulling away from her, just as he had with Hannah and countless others before her. And though she hadn't admitted it yet, I knew she could feel it. One night, as she sat on the couch, staring blankly at her laptop, I walked into the room and leaned against the doorway. "You look tired," I said, my voice casual. She glanced up at me, her eyes hollow. "It's just work," she muttered. "Richard's been demanding." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. "You know," I said finally, "people like him always demand more than they give. And when they're done, they move on without a second thought." Her head snapped up, her expression a mixture of surprise and defensiveness. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just an observation," I said with a shrug, turning to leave the room. "Good night, Amelia." As I walked away, I could feel her eyes on me, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. She was starting to realize the truth. About Richard, about herself, about the choices she had made. The web was tightening, and soon enough, there would be no escape. For either of them. By the time I started putting the pieces into motion, the path ahead was clear. Richard wasn't just a man who had wormed his way into my marriage. He was a man who thrived on control, manipulation, and destruction. And now, he was about to learn what it felt like to have the tables turned. I couldn't do it alone. This wasn't a battle that could be won by brute force or a heated confrontation. It required strategy, precision, and allies who understood the stakes. That's where Ethan, Clara, Lila, and Hannah came in. Each of them brought something different to the table. Ethan's meticulous research, Clara's connections, Lila's inside access, and Hannah's first-hand experience with Richard's methods. The plan started to take shape during one of our late-night strategy calls. We met at Clara's apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside providing the perfect backdrop for the discussions that unfolded. Clara poured us all coffee as Ethan spread out a folder of documents on the table. "Here's what we have so far," Ethan began, gesturing to the papers. Financial discrepancies in Richard's previous companies, a string of HR complaints that were quietly buried, and evidence of unethical practices in his current role. It's not enough to bring him down completely, but it's enough to raise questions. "And questions are all we need," I said, leaning forward. "We're not going for a knockout punch. We're going to dismantle him piece by piece." The others nodded, the tension in the room thick but focused. Hannah spoke up next, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "I can share my story publicly, but it has to be timed perfectly. If we release it too soon, he'll spin it as a personal vendetta. But if we wait until the evidence builds, it becomes undeniable," Clara finished, her eyes narrowing. "He won't be able to escape it." Lila, who had been unusually quiet, finally chimed in. "He's getting careless," she said. "I've been meeting with him regularly, and he's already making moves to replace Amelia. He's confident, arrogant, and completely unaware that I'm onto him." Her words lit a fire inside me. I had suspected Richard's plans to discard Amelia, but hearing it confirmed only deepened my resolve. He had underestimated her, and me, for the last time. The first step of the plan was simple: expose Richard's manipulations within the company. Using the documents Ethan had gathered and the accounts from Hannah and others, we compiled a dossier that painted a clear picture of Richard's pattern of behavior. Lila helped leak the information to key figures within the company, trusted colleagues who were already wary of Richard's methods. The whispers started almost immediately, growing louder with each passing day. Meanwhile, I focused on Amelia. I didn't confront her directly, but I planted seeds of doubt every chance I got. Subtle comments about trust, loyalty, and the consequences of poor decisions. I could see the tension in her shoulders grow with each passing day, the cracks in her confidence widening as she began to realize that her golden savior wasn't as untouchable as she believed. But the real turning point came when we learned about an upcoming corporate gala, a high-profile event where Richard planned to announce a major business deal. It was the perfect opportunity to strike. The plan for the gala was meticulous. Lila would keep Richard distracted, feeding his ego with just enough flattery to ensure he didn't suspect a thing. Ethan and Clara would work behind the scenes, ensuring that the leaked documents made their way to key attendees. And Hannah would be ready to step forward if the moment called for it, her story serving as the final nail in Richard's coffin. As for me, my role was simple: stay calm, stay composed, and wait for the right moment to confront Amelia. I didn't want her blindsided by what was about to unfold, but I also didn't want to tip her off too soon. She needed to see the full scope of Richard's downfall to understand just how deeply she had been deceived. The night before the gala, I found her sitting in the living room, her laptop open but untouched. She looked up as I entered the room, her expression guarded. "Big night tomorrow," I said casually, pouring myself a drink. She nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Yeah, Richard's been stressed. He wants everything to go perfectly. Doesn't he always?" I replied, taking a sip. "But you know what they say about perfection. It's usually hiding something." Her eyes darted to mine, a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Crossing her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. "Good luck tomorrow," I said, my tone deliberately neutral. "It should be an interesting night." As I left the room, I felt the weight of her gaze on my back. She didn't know it yet, but the world she and Richard had built was about to come crashing down, and I would be there to watch every moment of it unfold. The night of the gala had a strange electricity in the air, the kind that tightens your chest and makes you hyper-aware of every detail. I'd spent weeks planning this moment, but now that it was here, I felt calm, calmer than I had in months. This wasn't just a battle for my marriage or my dignity. It was a reckoning for Richard, a man who thrived on deceit and manipulation. Tonight, he would finally face the consequences of his actions. Amelia and I arrived together, a picture-perfect couple on the surface. She wore a stunning black dress, her smile practiced and poised, but I could sense the tension behind it. She hadn't said much on the drive over, and her grip on her clutch was tighter than usual. I wondered if some part of her knew what was coming, if she could sense the storm gathering just outside her line of sight. The gala itself was a grand affair, held in one of the city's most opulent venues. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and the buzz of conversation filled the air. Richard was already there, of course, basking in the attention as though he were the guest of honor. He stood near the center of the room, holding court with a group of executives and board members. His charisma was on full display, his laughter echoing above the crowd like a performer confident in his act. I stayed on the edges at first, watching, waiting. Ethan, Clara, and Lila were already in position. Ethan had made sure the dossier, containing the damning evidence of Richard's unethical practices, had been distributed to key players in the room earlier that day. Clara was mingling effortlessly, subtly steering conversations toward Richard's questionable history. And Lila? Lila was with him, playing her part perfectly, her laughter soft and conspiratorial as she kept him occupied. Hannah arrived quietly, slipping into the room unnoticed. She wore a simple dress, her demeanor calm but determined. We exchanged a brief nod across the room. She knew her role, and I trusted her to play it when the time was right. The evening unfolded like clockwork. Dinner was served, speeches were made, and the anticipation built as Richard prepared to make his big announcement. Amelia stayed close to me, but her focus was elsewhere. Her eyes darted toward Richard every few minutes, and I could see the unease creeping in. She wasn't sure what was wrong, but she could feel it, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air grows heavy and still. Finally, the moment came. Richard took the stage, his confidence radiating as he addressed the room. He spoke about the company's success, his vision for the future, and the groundbreaking deal they were about to close. The crowd applauded, their admiration palpable. But then, as he was basking in the applause, the first ripple of discontent spread through the room. It started with a whisper. A phone screen illuminated here, a hushed conversation there. The dossier had begun to circulate, its contents undeniable. Emails detailing Richard's manipulations, records of financial discrepancies, and testimonials from former employees painted a damning picture of the man standing on the stage. Richard faltered, his smile slipping as he noticed the shift in the room. His voice wavered slightly as he continued his speech, but the whispers grew louder, the tension thickening. And then, Hannah stood. "I'd like to say something," she said, her voice clear and steady. All eyes turned to her, and Richard froze, his hand tightening around the microphone. Hannah stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Richard's. "You talk about vision and leadership, but the truth is, you've built your success on lies. You've used people, manipulated them, and discarded them when they were no longer useful. I know because I was one of them." The room went silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Clara stepped in. "There's more," Clara said, holding up a printed copy of the dossier. "Everything you need to know about Richard Bowman is in here. His financial misconduct, his unethical behavior, his pattern of abuse. It's all documented." The floodgates opened then. Questions, accusations, murmurs of disbelief filled the room. Richard tried to regain control, his voice rising in desperation, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses too credible to dismiss. His carefully constructed image was crumbling before his eyes. Amelia stood frozen beside me, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. She turned to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you?" I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. He did this to himself. Richard stormed out of the room shortly after, his departure marked by a deafening silence. The gala continued, but the energy had shifted. The guests no longer spoke of deals and successes. They spoke of betrayal and downfall. As for Amelia, she didn't say much on the drive home. She stared out the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I let the silence linger, knowing she had a lot to process. Tonight, she had seen Richard for who he truly was. And by morning, she would have to face the full weight of her choices and their consequences. The morning after the gala was unsettlingly quiet. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like a fog, heavy and suffocating. I woke up earlier than usual, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night. Richard's carefully crafted world had come crashing down in a spectacular, public fashion. And Amelia? She'd been caught in the wreckage. When I finally got out of bed, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. She was still in her robe, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She didn't look at me when I entered, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the mug. "Morning," I said casually, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She didn't respond, just stared down at her coffee as though it held answers she desperately needed. I sat across from her, taking a slow sip and letting the silence stretch. I wasn't going to be the one to break it. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know?" "Did I know what?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She looked up at me then, her eyes red-rimmed and brimming with something I couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Guilt? About Richard. About everything that happened last night. I set my cup down carefully, meeting her gaze. "I had an idea," I said. "It wasn't hard to figure out, Amelia. The signs were all there." Her expression crumpled, and she pressed a hand to her forehead. "I didn't see it. I didn't see any of it. How could I have been so stupid?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. "Because you didn't want to see it. You let yourself believe in the version of Richard that he wanted you to see. The charming, supportive boss. But last night? That was the real Richard." She flinched at my words, her hand dropping to her lap. "You don't have to rub it in, Liam." "I'm not rubbing it in," I said evenly. "I'm telling you the truth. Something Richard clearly never did." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You must think I'm pathetic. Falling for his lies, letting him manipulate me." I didn't respond immediately. Truthfully, I didn't know what I thought anymore. Part of me wanted to agree with her, to throw her betrayal back in her face. But another part of me, a part one wasn't sure I trusted, felt something close to pity. "What I think," I said after a long pause, "is that you made a mistake. A big one. And now you have to decide what you're going to do about it." Her gaze snapped to mine, her eyes narrowing. "What am I supposed to do, Liam? My reputation is ruined. My career is probably over, and I've lost everything." "Everything?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you think? That you've lost everything?" She hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean me," I finished for her, my voice sharp. "Of course not. Because in all of this, you never once considered what you were throwing away. Our marriage. Our trust. You didn't lose everything, Amelia. You gave it away." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. She looked away, her hands clenching into fists on the table. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her spine, as though bracing herself for a battle she knew she couldn't win. "You're right," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I made a mistake. I let him get into my head, and I let him ruin everything I worked for. But I'm not going to let him destroy me." There it was, the fire I hadn't seen in her for months. The woman who had built a successful career, who had once been my partner in every sense of the word, was still there. She was just buried under layers of guilt and regret. "I hope you mean that," I said, standing up and taking my coffee with me. "Because rebuilding what you've broken won't be easy. And it won't happen overnight." She didn't reply, but I saw the determination in her eyes as I left the room. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of something that might have been hope. Not hope for us, not yet, but hope that Amelia could find her way back to herself. Over the next few days, The fallout from the gala continued to unfold. Richard was facing an internal investigation, his career hanging by a thread. Amelia, meanwhile, started taking small steps to rebuild her life. She resigned from her position at the company, cutting ties with the man who had nearly destroyed her. At home, things were tense. We spoke in short, clipped sentences, careful not to venture into dangerous territory. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I saw glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with. A joke shared over dinner. A quiet thank you for a cup of tea. They weren't much, but they were enough to keep me from walking away. For now, that would have to be enough. The days after Amelia resigned were marked by a strange calm in our house. The chaos of the gala and the fallout with Richard had subsided, leaving us in a liminal space, somewhere between the wreckage of the past and the uncertainty of what came next. I wasn't sure where we stood, but for the first time in months, I could see that Amelia was beginning to grasp the weight of her choices. I woke up one morning to find her in the living room, surrounded by stacks of papers and her laptop. She was still in her pajamas, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and there was an intensity in her expression that I hadn't seen in years. She didn't notice me at first, too focused on whatever she was working on. I leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment before finally speaking. "Starting a new project?" I asked, my tone deliberately casual. She looked up, startled, and for a second, I saw something like guilt flash across her face. But then she straightened, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Something like that," she said quietly. "I'm trying to figure out my next step." I walked over and glanced at the papers scattered across the coffee table. Resumes, notes, a list of potential companies she could apply to. It was clear she wasn't just sitting in her guilt. She was planning, rebuilding. Leaving the company was the right choice, I said, sitting down across from her. "But what about everything else? Have you thought about what you're going to do to fix that?" Her hands paused over the keyboard, and she met my gaze. "If you're asking whether I've thought about us, the answer is yes. I think about it constantly." "Thinking about it isn't enough, Amelia," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You can't undo what happened. But if you want to move forward, you need to take accountability. Not just with me, but with yourself." She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I know," she said. I'm trying. I've been journaling, and I've started looking for a therapist. I know I need to understand why I let things with Richard happen before I can even think about asking you to forgive me." Her honesty caught me off guard. For so long, she had been defensive, dismissive, unwilling to acknowledge the depth of her betrayal. But now, for the first time, she seemed willing to face it head-on. It didn't erase the damage, but it was a start. "I don't need perfection, Amelia," I said after a long pause. "But I need to see effort. Real effort. If you're serious about fixing this, then I'm willing to try too. But you have to meet me halfway." She looked at me, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I will, Liam. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes." The rest of the day passed quietly, but something had shifted between us. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a step toward one. Later that evening, as we sat together on the couch watching a movie, I felt a tentative sense of hope. For the first time in months, it felt like we were on the same side, both fighting to rebuild something that had been broken. Amelia wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. Together. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than words. In the days that followed our tentative conversation in the living room, Amelia and I existed in a fragile truce. We didn't fight. We didn't push. Instead, we orbited around each other cautiously, like two people walking on cracked ice, unsure which step might send us plunging into the cold. Amelia spent most of her time focusing on herself, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw her putting in real effort. She started therapy, as she had promised, and came home from her sessions with an expression that was a mix of exhaustion and relief. At night, she would sit on the couch with a journal, her pen moving furiously across the pages as though she were trying to exorcise her guilt onto paper. I didn't ask what she wrote. I wasn't ready for that level of vulnerability from her, and maybe she wasn't ready to share it. Instead, I watched from a distance, letting her take the steps she needed to take while keeping my own boundaries firmly in place. But even as she worked to rebuild herself, there was a part of me that remained guarded. Could we really fix this? Could I ever look at her and not see Richard's shadow lingering in the background? The questions haunted me, and the answers felt maddeningly out of reach. One evening, as we sat in the living room, her with her journal, me with a book I wasn't really reading, she broke the silence. "I talked about you in therapy today," she said, her voice soft but steady. I looked up, surprised. "Oh." She set her journal aside, folding her hands in her lap. "My therapist asked me why I was so drawn to Richard. Why I let myself ruin what we had for someone like him." I stayed silent, giving her the space to continue. "And I realized something," she said, her gaze fixed on her hands. "It wasn't about Richard at all. It was about me. About my own insecurities, my need for validation, my inability to face the parts of myself that felt broken." Her words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but they felt honest in a way I hadn't expected. I closed my book, leaning forward slightly. "And what about us?" I asked. "Where do we fit into that?" She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine. "You were always steady, Liam. Always there. But I took that for granted. I stopped appreciating you, stopped appreciating what we had, because I was too caught up in chasing something that didn't matter. I see that now, and I hate that it took losing so much to realize it." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly wiped at her eyes, as if embarrassed by the tears. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I said, my tone measured. "It's going to take time. And honestly, I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we were before." "I don't want what we had before," she said quietly. "I want something better, something honest." That admission hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, it felt like we were speaking the same language, both of us acknowledging the pain, the betrayal, but also the sliver of hope that we might be able to build something new. Over the next few weeks, things didn't magically fix themselves. There were still moments of tension, still nights when the memories of what had happened threatened to pull me under. But there were also moments of connection, small, tentative steps toward healing. A shared laugh over a silly TV show, a quiet walk in the park, a conversation that felt more honest than anything we'd had in years. Amelia wasn't the same person she'd been before Richard, and neither was I. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this new version of us, scarred but still standing, was worth fighting for. And as I sat next to her one evening, our hands brushing but not quite touching, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.